if you arranged it in a different manner, would that be a new expression of an idea? Are the features of the songs ideas in themselves? Would playing the same note, in let's say a different kind of a musical tradition, let's say I bring it to Carnatic music, would that be a new expression of an idea? So where does one draw the line between idea and expression when it comes to something like musical form? And this is kind of vital to another question, which is that often the assumption is that principles of intellectual property are principles of law. And that's a big mistake, because they're never only principles of law, they are aesthetic principles. How does a judge determine, at the end of the day, whether there is substantial infringement or not? It is what you describe in copyright as the look and feel test, right? Or the hear and feel test, that you require a certain kind of an aesthetic sensibility that you're passing judgment on. So copyright does not just take an existing realm of culture, as an independent reality and describe it. It actually constitutes that object of culture in its description. And this is vital, because if you start looking at the ways in which, different kind of people, whether a music expert or a lawyer and judge, would listen to and understand a certain tradition of cultural production, you could arrive at very different conclusions. Because in a lot of ways what we are taking as the principles that we know, for example, idea, expression, dichotomy, are taken from the literary work, which don't translate easily into music. And that really is the dilemma. I want to play an example of a case here. And this is, just before the Beatles were going to break up, they kind of, the first person, ironically, to have a solo hit was not Paul McCartney or John Lennon.
It was George Harrison.
George Harrison, right? And the song was this one.
That the Hare Rama Hare Krishna the end. Oh, okay,
No, this is the critical bit. Okay. What are you saying?
I thought you were waiting for the Hare Rama Hare Krishna at the end.
No. It's so he began by kind of randomly singing, Hare Rama Hare Krishna, Hare Rama Hare Krishna, then started intersecting My Sweet Lord. Figured this is not a bad cue, and went on to become a big hit. And the Chiffons then sued him for copyright infringement, and the song that they sued him for was this one. Yeah, so the He's So Fine and My Sweet Lord. Now, in the case, to prove copyright infringement, there are two things that you have to show. The first is that you had access, right, to a particular, object, and the second is that there was substantial copy, right? Now, in the case of George Harrison, there was something very strange that happened. So they couldn't prove that he consciously copied the song. And the judge, in fact, says that I don't think he actually did copy the song. But what they could prove was that when George Harrison was growing up in Liverpool, the Chiffons was a pretty famous and a popular band. And it is very likely that George Harrison would have heard He's So Fine. So the question is, how do I then prove whether or not there was substantial infringement or whether there was an intention to infringe at all? The judge, and I'll read out that segment of the judgment, says, I conclude that the composer, in seeking musical materials to clothe his thoughts, was working with various possibilities. As he tried this possibility and that, there came to the surface of his mind a particular combination that pleased him as being one that he felt would be appealing to a prospective listener. In other words, that this combination of sounds would work. Why? Because the subconscious knew it already, that it had already worked in a song, which his conscious mind did not remember. Having arrived at this pleasing combination of sounds, the recording was made, the lead sheet prepared for copyright, and the song became an enormous success. Did George Harrison deliberately use the music of He's So Fine? I do not believe that he did so deliberately. Nevertheless, it is clear that My Sweet Lord is the very same song as He's So Fine with different words. And Harrison had access to it. This is, under the law, infringement of copyright and is no less so, even though subconsciously accomplished. So you have a scenario where, now here you're talking about, the law adjudicating on conscious and subconscious creativity. Now there's an entire theory of authorship, even in romantic theory. If you talk about William Blake, Coleridge, all the romantics, all of them spoke about the absolute critical vitality of the subconscious as the agent of creativity. So Coleridge's famous Zandu was written when he was on dope, right? So this is so here is the scenario of how do we understand these two. You have a judgment which says that it doesn't matter that your subconscious may have known it, as long as you know that we know that you had access to it. What happens then to the entire idea of creativity in terms of a tradition, of understanding a musical tradition itself? And the best case to illustrate this in terms of where the dangers may lie is a case which is, okay, you guys can identify again. Very distinct sound.
Run Through the Jungle. It's like it.
Well, this is John Fogerty's comeback album, Centipede. The Old Man Down the Road.
Okay.
And he was sued by Saul Zaentz for infringement of copyright. And the song that he was in violation was Run Through the Jungle. Okay. So. The irony of this, of course, is that Run Through the Jungle was written by John Fogerty
himself.
when he was a part of CCR, right? So, but here is an important principle, which is that there's a distinction between authorship and ownership. And the political economy of music and film or any other modes of creativity is such that it is very rare that the author is actually the owner of copyright, right? I mean, in law, the author is deemed to be, except in film, the first owner of copyright. But in practice, it's very rarely the case. So in Fogerty's case, what had actually happened was when he was a part of CCR, he had a major dispute and a falling out with a producer of theirs called Saul Zaentz. And he ended up then writing 2 songs which were critical about Saul Zaentz, including one called Mr. Green, in his comeback album. Now, you would imagine that a classical approach would have been for Saul Zaentz to sue him for defamation. But instead, Saul Zaentz sues him for copyright infringement. Which also brings us to another important point, which is that increasingly the line between freedom of speech and expression and censorship and copyright begins to get blurred, right? Where the ownership of material becomes a basis on which you can actually censor other people from either using it critically, etc. So in this case, he claimed that The Old Man Down the Road was a violation of CCR and Saul Zaentz's copyright, even though John Fogerty himself had written the song. In other words, that you could be in violation of your own copyright. Right? Now this is where the problem of the expansion of copyright becomes very acute in music. But what is interesting in this case was that the hearing and the trial, which went on for a day and a half, basically involved John Fogerty blurring the boundaries of the courtroom and a recording studio.